Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ashley DeHoyas. I'm the curator at DiverseWorks here in Houston, Texas. I'm excited to be presenting today our Spring 2020 Diverse Discourse Lecture series with guest curator Larry Ossei-Mensah. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping ground rules. And then do a land acknowledgement, and we'll get into Larry's talk. If you need anything or have any questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A options at the bottom of your screen. We do have an Asl Interpretation Team with us today. Thank you so much, Sandra and Eduardo, who are here with us. If you need captions or anything, please feel free to reach out. This event will be streaming live on our YouTube channel, as well as be archived and recorded on our website. So briefly, we're going to get started. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land in which we reside. Today, we gather with you on the land currently called Houston, Texas. It lies within the ancestral territories of the Karankawa and Atacapa Ishak Saunas people. I also recognize the Native people that share the Southeast Texas region, including the Tawankawa and the Kulanteca and the Como Cruz. We acknowledge this land has occupied unceded territory and pay tribute to them. For those of you that would like to do the same or to share where you're calling in from, please feel free to put your names in the chat. I'd also like to take a moment of silence just for everything that is going on in the world. And if you feel at this time too that you'd like to put your ancestors' names and bring them into the room with you, please do so. Okay. So I'm going to briefly give a bio, a brief bio of Larry Ossei-Mensah, and Maya, our program assistant, will drop the official bio in the chat, as well as our link to our DiverseWorks webpage, where you can read more information about the Diverse Discourse guest lecture series, as well as Larry's vast experiences in the creative field. I have been following Larry's work since I was a graduate student at MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art, and I'm really excited to have Larry here. Larry has worked with several artists that I deeply admire, and I'm super excited to introduce Larry to some Houston artists that I'm currently interested in, as well as the Houston community. This week, Larry, as part of the Diverse Discourse guest lecture series, participated in a series of studio visits from a group of individuals who applied for a Diverse Discourse studio lecture call, as well as a small list of artists that were put together by individuals based on common interests, as well as artists that I felt that really needed to connect with Larry. And so we're excited to hear about all the wonderful studio visits that Larry has participated in. And we're super excited to have Larry give a talk as the culminating event. Larry currently serves as the Curator-at-Large at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and is the co-founder of ARTNOIR, a 501c3 nonprofit, and a global collective of culturalists who design a multi-model experiences aimed to engage this generation's dynamic and diverse creative class. As a curator and cultural critic, he has organized exhibitions and programs at commercial and nonprofit spaces around the globe, and we are so excited to welcome Larry as our 2020 Spring Diverse Discourse guest lecture. So Larry, it's yours now. Take it away.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to DiverseWorks. Thank you to the team, everybody who made this week possible. Ashley and I have actually been in conversation for a while, just trying to land on the right timing to collaborate. And it actually was just really refreshing this week to just have conversations with, the various creative, imaginative, talented artists from the Houston community. I haven't had a chance to be in Houston in a couple of years, so it's nice to just kind of see what are artists thinking about? What are they making work about? What are some of their concerns? And so thank you to Ashley. Thank you to all the artists who offered up their time to just share what they're working on. And hopefully our conversation stimulated some ideas and hopefully will inspire them and to continue to push in their practice and be voices for not only the Houston community, but voices for artists around the world. So today, my conversation is really going to give you a little bit of insight into who I am, um, my practice, and then also share some of the tools that I've developed over the last 12, 15 years as a curator. Well, first starting off as a photographer, then writer, then curator. Now working to expand and cultivate a nonprofit, which is ARTNOIR, and just share with you my journey because I think it's important for us who work in the arts, whether you're an artist or a cultural worker, to kind of know that there doesn't have to be a linear approach towards getting or finding success or finding things that nourish you, things that will allow you to engage your passion. And so just want to talk about that. And then, so I'll aim to talk for about 40, 45 minutes. And then at the end, we will take some questions. So I would love to just hear questions from the audience. And thanks again. So next slide. So my name is Larry Ossei-Mensah. Again, curator from the Bronx, first generation Ghanaian-American. And I just wanted to, I've been doing a lot of clubhouses. So if you are familiar with Clubhouse, I want to set the room with these 10 ideas or concepts that, do not require talent, And so I like to start this because I feel like if you're able to execute even half of this, it puts you on a competitive playing ground, I guess, with other artists. And I think it's things that we all can do as human beings, hopefully. So being on time, for me is a huge thing. So whether that's studio visits, whether that's if there's a deadline to deliver an essay or work, making an effort. I think for me, a lot of times what separates good artists from great artists is not only passion, but the effort that they put into their creative production. And it's something that, is very evident, particularly if you've been doing this a long time. It's very clear whether this artist or creative is putting in the effort to really kind of push their creative expression, whatever tools they are that they use. Be high energy. I think I won't pretend that everybody can be an extrovert. Like I had to work very hard to get to this point where I'm comfortable, doing presentations. But I think particularly if you're an artist and you're sharing your work, your number one fan of your work should be you. And being high energy, being enthusiastic, having a positive attitude, being passionate, good body language. These are all things that we can work towards developing, that'll open up doors and possibilities and opportunities regardless of where within the creative ecosystem you work. Be coachable. I think a lot of times, and I think that's what was great about talking to the artists this week, is that it was a dialogue and it was a conversation, and the artists were open to insights, but we also weren't afraid to kind of push back, when they had a clear kind of stance and position on what their practice is offering. And I think being coachable, being receptive to feedback is one of the most important things to grow, not only as an artist, but I think as a human being. Do a little extra, be prepared, and have a strong work ethic. I think for me, these are kind of some of the intangibles that I look at. If I had to match, two painters, for example, that are equally talented, then I have to gauge, okay, who has the more rigorous work ethic. So these are some things that hopefully you'll keep in mind and kind of remember. I believe are essential tools towards being, a creative who was able to thrive expand, and take their practice to the next level. Next slide. And the other thing I wanted to remind folks, this is another kind of set the table slide, is that, remember that artists are here to teach us and share with us, and the importance of, cultivating ideas, developing ideas, thinking outside the box. Next slide. Because it's that thinking outside the box that always is going to give you a competitive advantage, just in life. I think a lot of times we that work as whether artists, creatives, cultural workers, don't lean into the fact that our creativity that drives society, whether it's music, whether it's visual arts, whether it's performance, literature, these are all essential components that undergird as society. But it's important that we think outside the box and push against the status quo in order to really help our society grow and evolve. Next slide. And so we'll get to this later in the conversation, but I'd like to share this. This is a toolbox that I've developed over the last 15 years. It's a toolbox that I find to be fluid. It started off with just kind of 4, and now it's kind of expanded to 6, with investing in yourself being the last kind of tool that I've added to the toolbox. And it really came from hearing artists, particularly if you're an artist who is maybe working a full-time job or raising a family or just has other responsibilities in addition to developing their practice, and just talking about strategies that allow you to carve out the time necessary in order to develop the practice and evolve as an artist. Next slide. So as I said before, my name is Larry Ossei-Mensah. I grew up in the South Bronx. My entrance into the arts started as a photographer back in 2007. And this is an image from my first solo exhibition that I also co-curated. And over the last, I don't even know, 10, 15 years, I've been able to inhabit a number of roles within the art world and been able to see it from a variety of different standpoints. And, the one thing that I always like to stress with folks is that I'm self-taught as a curator. My BA is in business management, and I have an MBA in marketing and hospitality. And so everything that I've done in the arts has been by, learning by doing, learning by, putting myself out there, taking a risk, just putting in the work. And I always like to stress that because I every so often talk to individuals who maybe are pivoting careers. So maybe they worked in computer science or was a lawyer and want to be an artist. And there's this hesitance to make that pivot. And I just always like to share that, I've come to this from a place of passion. The arts nourish me. And that's my motivating factor to continue to educate myself, grow, tell my story, do visits with artists, and challenge myself within my curatorial practice. Next slide. And so my journey started off as a photographer. I did that for a while, and I realized that wasn't quite for me. I think one of the challenges that I quite wasn't equipped for with being an artist is being open to critique. And that's why I say being coachable is important, because I knew that as an artist, I wouldn't say I wasn't coachable, but critique was something that was difficult for me to grasp. And so I'm talking from first person experience that, like, if I were more coachable, I'd be really curious about where I would be in my career if I wanted to continue that path on photography. So worked as a photographer, pivoted from that and started writing about artists. And in my writing, really focusing on emerging artists of my generation. So I wrote about Toyin Oji when she was still a grad student in San Francisco, Njideka Akinyele Crosby when she just finished at Yale. And I've primarily focused on cultural publications, because this is about 2009, 2010, the art world had this kind of pecking order that if you didn't meet, you weren't necessarily going to be invited to write for the art forums of the world. And so for me, I had to be creative and identify platforms that allowed me to tell the story of artists that I thought was interesting, and tell those stories to a broader audience who might not necessarily always be exposed to contemporary art. Next slide. And so, going through that journey of doing photography, writing didn't really pay well. Um, and then concurrently, I was also working a job, so I worked in marketing at Viacom, and I was curating shows, writing, just doing everything I could to establish a foothold within the ecosystem. And they came to a kind of a point where, or everything came to a head where I had to kind of decide what's going to be the next steps. How am I really going to be entrenched in this space and be of service to artists. And so I had to ask myself that question: how am I going to be a leader in this space? Next slide. And so, over the last 10, 15 years, I had to develop these guiding principles that inform my curatorial practice. And I use this as a litmus test that will help me decide whether I'm going to do a project, whether I'm going to work with a particular artist or institution. And it's something that I encourage people to do, because a lot of times, particularly whether you're beginning your career or in the middle of your career, you're going to have moments where there's going to be hopefully a lot of attention around what you're doing, and a lot of opportunities coming to you left and right. And so how do you decide, what exhibition to participate in if you're an artist, if you're a curator, what institution to work with or what job to apply for? And so for me, I'm always thinking about, does this opportunity and project allow for access? Someone who grew up first generation Ghanaian-American and a working class community, visual arts in terms of contemporary art, going to museums, was not something that I did as a young person, right? So I'm always thinking about my 16-year-old self and what would I be interested and excited about. Growing up in the Bronx, I was exposed to graffiti, other art forms, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that that was also kind of just another way that I was kind of incubating my understanding and love for the arts. Creating a sense of belonging, curiosity and conversation, establishing value, catalysts for diversity and collaboration. These are all essential components that guide my decision making in my curatorial practice. And I invite you all to think about, what are the things that guide you and what you do? Whether you're an artist, whether you're an architect, how do you judge the things that you are going to invest your energy, time, and passion in? Next slide. And so this is just, a couple of examples to kind of articulate these different principles. So this is a collaboration I did with Nina Chanel Abney and my collective ARTNOIR at National Sawdust, and in partnership with Samara Pendahughes, who's a writer composer, and Ambrose Akminsora, Aja Monet, who's a poet. And for me, this came from a question of trying to figure out what happens when you create a liminal space, I guess, or attempt to create a liminal space where art, visual art, where you have the projection of Nina's work, music, and poetry intersect. And this was a beautiful event. We did it at National Sawdust. As you can see, the performance was in the round. And in my mind, this was an attempt to remove this hierarchy, and really kind of allow the audience to kind of be enmeshed and immersed in the conversation. So again, thinking about different strategies that I could employ to make these experiences accessible. Next slide. And creating a sense of belonging. So as was mentioned by Ashley, I'm the Curator-at-Large at BAM. At the top of the year, for MLK weekend, in collaboration with several artists, did a digital exhibition. So given the fact that BAM is still closed to physical performances and exhibitions, we do have this billboard that's on the corner of Flatbush and Lafayette. And so for me as a curator, thinking about, okay, what other modalities could be leveraged in order to have a conversation, right? And so this project was called Let Freedom Ring. And I basically invited 7 artists to meditate on what does freedom mean, going into a new administration, thinking about the legacy of Dr. King, and then putting this in the public sphere, right? Offering this back to Brooklyn, right? And seeing what conversations it stimulated in the community, and really kind of doubling down on my belief that art doesn't just have to be engaged in a white cube in an exhibition space. It could be in the public space. And then on the right is an image from a show I did with Peter Williams at Q Art Foundation in Chelsea. And this is a collaboration that I did with Urban Word. And a lot of what I do when I do organize exhibitions is making sure there's a component that is inviting young people to be part of the experience. Not just giving them a tour, but allowing them to respond to what they're seeing, because this is also how I learn. You know, as someone who's self-taught, I'm continually making sure I'm in a posture of learning and not always trying to be in a posture of like, you know, teaching. You know, I think it's for me, it's a nice balance, and it keeps me hungry, you know, to want to do more through my work. Next slide. Curiosity and conversation. So, you know, just us having this chat, and I look forward to hearing your questions at the end of this presentation, is something that stimulates for me. Again, because it's how I learn. But then it's also, you know, there are many times where I want to see certain artists in dialogue. You know, so in the top right corner, you have Joan Jonas and Jason Moran, who've been collaborating over a decade. You know, this is an intergenerational conversation. This is a intermedium conversation, as Jason is a writer, composer, you know, Joan, visual artist, performance artist, gender, you know, you know, I guess intergender, I don't know if that's a word, but, you know, we have a woman and a man collaborating. And then, you know, obviously different racial backgrounds. And so I was curious about like, how is this collaboration been able to sustain itself over 10 years? That's a long time for people to collaborate. And we did this at SVA and for the MFA students, because I was feeling that the students weren't really valuing the importance of collaboration in their grad studies. And so how could we create a scenario where they could be exposed to different ways of collaborating? Next slide. Value. So establishing a sense of value. I think along with belonging, you know, people want to feel valued, right? They want to feel acknowledged. And so that's something that is super important in everything that I do. You know, because the reality is me coming into the art world, I wasn't invited to the party, so to speak. You know, I've had to carve out space, and I've continually had to carve out space. But in doing that, I know that I also have to bring people up the ladder, right? And by bringing people up the ladder, I have to ensure that the space that I'm creating and sharing is something where everyone feels welcome, everyone can participate, everyone's word or voice can be heard. Next slide. Catalyst for diversity. So in terms of when I think about diversity, I'm not just thinking about, you know, race. I'm thinking about class. I'm thinking about, you know, how people choose to identify, you know, so thinking about LGBTQI, I'm thinking about indigenous communities. And so that for me, like yesterday, I was talking with an artist. I'm doing a group show at the Collective in Memphis in July, and you know, the artist was asking me about, you know, the makeup of the artists participating, and I had to explain to him that, you know, for me, that's part of the deal. You know, I made a decision years ago that I don't necessarily need to screen that this is a diverse show. You're going to see it by the artists that I choose to collaborate and invite to be part of the conversation. And so for me, it's just something that I made a choice to just ingrain it in the work, right? Because I think, particularly given this current climate and this in this reckoning that you're seeing with a lot of institutions, some people will make a gesture, you know, some people will start an initiative, but I am from the point of view that, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion is continuous work. You know, like you know, if you look at the DNA that's shaped this country, you know, a lot of the challenges that we all have, as me as a Black man in New York City, um, uh, they're not going away tomorrow, right? So it's a continuous journey to make things better. You know, I think you see what the verdict this week, you know, in the George Floyd case. One step towards justice, but still a lot of work to be done. And so for me, I'm constantly in this posture of continuous improvement, and it needs to be embedded in all the shows that I do. Next slide. This is another example of a show I did, Coffee Wrong Sugar Gold at Moad in 2019. And it was basically interrogating this question of like, you know, the post-colonial paradox. You know, does post-colonial even exist? You know, depending on where you live in this country, you still are confronted with the ripple effects of colonialism, imperialism, systematic racism. And so this was an interesting question to kind of interrogate, because normally colonialism is looked through the lens of the Caribbean or various diasporas, but what happens when you put that mirror on yourself and look at what's really happening on the ground at home? Next slide. And this is an exhibition I did 2019 in Miami at Ulai Arts. And this was part of a series of exhibitions that I started called On the Road. And it was a effort to critique Jack Kerouac's book. And it's also, for me, it was a way to process my peripatetic curatorial practice. At the time, I was ending my term at MOAD as senior curator, but still working, vigorously with Ulai as a curatorial consultant. And I was interested in looking at what's the dialogue and conversation happening between artists in Detroit, artists that I've met in Detroit and the artists that I've met in Michigan. But then how do I also still kind of illustrate that cultural nuance? So on the left slide, the window, that's an installation by an artist based in Detroit, Osman Khan. And it was interesting because at the opening, he's Southeast Asian. I met a woman who's Southeast Asian, and she was just moved by the fact that living in Miami, she rarely sees exhibitions that highlights her culture. So for me, that was a moving moment, but it reaffirms the importance of making sure that as many different voices can be included in the conversation, dynamic voices that can be included in the conversation. That was essential and important, and it always needs to be part of my approach. Next slide. And then collaboration. I think for me, I learn by doing. I learn from other people. I learn by working together, and being blessed to access someone else's knowledge and skill, and also being able to share what I know. But then also creating space with the public. So on the right is a install shot from an exhibition I did, Race and Revolution, Still Separate, Still Unequal, with Katie Fuller. And this is a piece by J.C. Lanohan that asked two fundamental questions. What was your race moment? What was your class moment? And then inviting the public to share a moment. And so for me, it's again trying to create these dynamic and tangible experiences for the viewer, so that seeing art is just not a passive experience, but it's an active experience that hopefully is inspirational, and you take those conversations with you when you leave the exhibition, whether with friends, family, colleagues. And so collaboration is paramount. Next slide. And this is another example of collaboration with Glenn Kino. Glenn is an artist I've known for a while. And this was the first time we had an opportunity to formally work together. It was my first exhibition at BAM. And this was entitled When a Pot Finds Its Purpose. And incredible opportunity to collaborate, work together, learn from Glenn. Glenn currently has an exhibition on view at Mass MoCA, and it should be up for about a year. And again, working together. Like for me, it's not, as a curator, me telling what an artist to do. It's us having a conversation so that we can manifest the best creative experience possible. Next slide. And so one thing that is important to point out as we transition to the next part of the conversation is the importance of perspective, right? Everyone has a perspective, everyone has a point of view. But I think within that, how do you remain open to other perspectives, other points of view, in order to instigate and stimulate a dynamic conversation that hopefully helps us all grow as not only individuals, but as a community and as a society. Next slide. And so going back to this toolbox, the framework, I call this my rules of engagement. These are different tools and ways of working and strategies that have helped me develop, not only just in my curatorial practice, but also in my life. For me, I'm in a unique, blessed position that art is my life. Most of my friends that I have, prior, if it's not prior to when I started working in the arts, most of my friends are in the arts, whether they're collectors, curators, writers. And so it's an essential thing for me to always reevaluate, what are the tools and strategies that I'm using to continue to grow in my practice. And I think these will be helpful for all of you watching today. So next slide. Next slide. So frameworks and platforms, next slide. So for me, in addition to the principles that I've cultivated, I also had to really identify what are the modalities of working that allow me to be the most effective, right? And to be efficient and not trying to do, I think we've been conditioned in this country to be a jack of all trades, which, is not a bad thing, but I think it doesn't always allow us to kind of really focus and hone in on something that, we're really passionate about and we really could master. So for me, I identified, as a curator, for example, exhibitions, public programs, social media, and publications as a different kind of verticals that will allow me to be effective and thinking about myself as this conceptual archaeologist that's uncovering this information through collaborating with artists and also learning from artists and other colleagues. Next slide. So obviously, as a curator, the exhibition format is a fundamental platform for us. And exhibition for me is kind of an open term. It's not just something that occurs in the white cube. It's something that can happen digitally, as I showed you with the project at BAM. It's also for me something that can happen, virtually through Instagram. Even, it could be something that happens through a dinner series. I think for me, the core thing is how do you create a platform and vehicle for discussion, for dialogue, for conversation, for learning, for challenging our assumptions and hopefully growing from that. And so I've attempted to cultivate an expansive view on what exhibitions can look like, feel like, and offer us. Next slide. Social media. So I mean, for me, if you follow me at all, I just find it a really incredible vehicle to share, what I find to be interesting. And then allow the practice to be dynamic, because I think the reality is that like not everyone's gonna read, like I just received in the mail a catalog. I wrote an essay for Genesis Tremaine's exhibition in Brussels. Not everybody's gonna want to read this, right? So what are some other strategies that I can employ to create space for artists to share what they're working on, share about their practice? And then, this one on the top with Hugo McLeod, have a little bit of fun, right? I think over the last year, we've probably been zoomed out, right? And so how do I make it interesting? Because for me, it's like, if it's not interesting for me and exciting for me, how is that going to be exciting to an audience? So always trying to insert some forms of play. As I mentioned before, utilizing platforms like Clubhouse, and really just trying to make these conversations accessible through social media as a tool. And I think that's an important thing to stress, that it's a tool. It is not a silver bullet. It's not your saving grace. It's not going to necessarily make you more popular in the arts. It's a tool that allows you to extend the conversation related to whatever your creative production may be. And then on the bottom, it's a conversation that I did on IG Live with Joy Manaya, who's an artist that I've been in dialogue with for the last 4 or 5 years. I've put her in a number of exhibitions, and she's constantly challenging me as a curator to always reconsider how I'm thinking about my practice, and my ideas around various concerns. Next slide. Publications. So I just showed you the catalog. I think there are people who like catalogs. I think catalogs are a great tool as well to share information, to unpack an inquiry, but then also prints. So that's been something I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years in collaboration with art and culture projects, in addition to Avant Arte this year. And again, going back to that accessibility, making sure that artists, particularly, POC artists who are doing really well and maybe might be at a price point that isn't approachable for everyone, how do we create a scenario and an opportunity that people can enjoy this art at a price point that may suit their budget? But then this is also another form of collaboration, because I typically select artists who it's their first edition that they're bringing to the public. So then we're, going through this back and forth to make sure that what we do produce is something of the highest quality. And so this is an edition I did with Von Span, and then the catalog for the exhibition Coffee Rum Sugar Gold that I co-curated with Dexter Wimberly at MOAD. Next slide. So artistic practice, next slide. I'm a firm believer, and this doesn't just apply to artistic practice. I think this is also for cultural workers, or whatever your industry is. Are you asking yourself, what is your why? Typically, I ask artists, why are you an artist? And they say, oh, because it's what I love to do. It's something that, comes natural to me, which is cool, but it's like, I don't think it's really interrogating the question enough, you know? And so I always invite artists to ask themselves why 5 times. Because by the time you get to that fifth why, then you really can evaluate, why do you do what you do, right? And it's important because, you're going to be invited to do certain projects. You're going to be faced with certain challenges, particularly, challenges that might relate to, your integrity. And if you don't know why you're doing this fundamentally, you're going to be in a very challenged position when those situations come up. But if you know, I mean, and this is an assumption, it's not a, you know, black and white rule, but I think it's a tool that, if you know why you're doing something, when you are put in a situation, if it doesn't align with your values, if it doesn't align with your goals, so talking about setting reasonable goals, then you know to say no to it, but if it does, then to investigate further to see if this is a fit for you. How do you keep your fingers on the pulse? So it was interesting to talk to all the artists, from Houston. I think being part of what DiverseWorks is putting together, which is incredible for me, is a sign that they're keeping their hands on the pulse and want to be in conversation with people will help them continue to rigorously think through their practice. How are we thinking about outside influences, and how are you finding inspiration? I think these are all important, things to consider when you're thinking about artistic practice. Next slide. Okay, what is your why? So again, purpose. Why do you want to be an artist? And then strategy. How are you fulfilling this purpose? And then what are the actionable goals? So the artists, again, who participated this week in the virtual studio visits, for them, they wanted to get feedback on their work. They wanted to find ways that they can push themselves, right? And I think also it's important as an artist, because you spend most of your time in the studio by yourself, so to get another set of eyes on the work, because I think when you're so enmeshed in the work and you're not getting feedback, you begin to not see clearly um, opportunities for growth. And so again, thinking about what are the actionable goals that you want to put in place for your practice in order to continue to grow as an artist. Next slide. What is your how? So guiding principles, which I mentioned before, do you have a work schedule? I am not under the assumption that every artist is able to work as an artist full time. And in the cases that you can't, what's the work schedule that you have? I remember meeting an artist a couple of weeks ago who works, as a paralegal at a law firm. And he goes to the studio from 7 to 9, goes to work, and then at the end of the workday goes back to the studio for another hour or two. It's not the same as working 8 hours, but you're putting in that time, you're carving out that space to make sure that you're giving your practice the attention it needs. And then how are you challenging yourself in the studio? I think this is an important thing to ask yourself, because I think it's easy to get comfortable with a certain way of working. You've made a series of photographs or paintings or videos that the public loves, but how are you continuing to challenge yourself so that you don't get stuck in this box, and you don't get typecasted? And continuing to create space for yourself to grow. Next slide. What is your what? So what kind of art are you making? I mean, that's always a question that I ask, and then also I think what was great about the visits this week is that artists were able to ask and get an insight into what was working and what was not working. So, and then also making sure you're getting feedback. So studio visits, critique groups. I would, at the Q&A section, I would love to hear if anybody's in a critique group. And again, where do you find inspiration? Next slide. 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 So all of those artists that we just shared, I'm sure you could identify some of those artists, right? And it might be because you know the work. But for me, as someone who comes from a business background, I think it's important for an artist to build a vocabulary, build a language, you know, build a brand, which I know is in the arts is still kind of frowned upon. But I think it's important because it provides a level of consistency, I think, and a space to have a unified kind of perspective. And I'm not necessarily saying that you need to make the same thing every time, but what is the connective tissue that brings your practice together that allows you to share your story, or whatever it is that you're looking at in your practice? Next slide. And so you have all these brands. I'm sure there's some of them you recognize and you love. And think about, why do you love, a KFC, for example, or a Colgate, or an IBM? What is it about these entities that you're like, they're tried and true. If I had a choice, I'm always going to choose them, right? And just thinking about that in relationship to not only an artistic practice, but cultural production. What is the connective tissue that tethers everything together, to allow your voice to be coherent and clear? Next slide. And so again, thinking about the brand called you. Next slide. And so, in traditional marketing, we always think about what's the problem, right? And then what is your position on the problem or the inquiry, right? So as an artist, it's like, what's the question? What's the hypothesis? And then how are you engaging this hypothesis through creative production? And then and what do we promise to see and experience through that? Next slide. So what are you investigating through your practice? What's the practice about? Your position, what kind of artist, curator, creative are you? I think these are important questions to meditate on. What are you seeking to express through your practice? I think a lot of times, I'll meet artists who are just making the make, but like, what is the impetus for the making beyond just kind of creative inspiration? Like, what are you, through your gift, wanting to share with the world? And thinking about that, and what can we expect to learn and experience when we see your work? Next slide. And then often artists ask me, what can I do to like expand my network? And I think, next slide, the number one thing you can do, going back, it should be number 11 on those 10 points that I said doesn't require like talent, showing up, being present. And so kudos to all the artists who wanted to participate in the virtual studio series this week, because they showed up for themselves, right? And they saw an opportunity and wanted to be part of something. And I think the work that DiverseWorks does as an institution, as an organization in the community, is reflective of the importance of showing up, because that can create really incredible dynamic opportunities for you. Next slide. And so next slide. Next. So, for me, I always like to make the distinction between, building, I think, tried and true relationships and networking. Networking is asking for a business card. Next. Relationship is asking someone about their day and really trying to know them and understand them. Because for me personally, I'm always turned off by someone who really isn't interested in knowing me as a person. They only know, oh, he's a curator and he may be able to help me, which is great. But like, how much research have you done on the shows that I've done? Is there a particular exhibition that I did that really is striking to you, or an artist that you want to know, why did I choose that artist? Really kind of showing an interest, because at the end of the day, the arts, like most industries, is about relationships. Who do you get to know? Not only just who you know, but who do you get to know? Next. Networking is let's grab a drink. Next. Relationship building is inviting someone to dinner. Like, think about who you want to really break bread with. That is such an intimate experience, particularly given in the era of COVID, the opportunity to gather is even more precious. And so when you do have those opportunities, who's sitting at the table with you? Next. Networkers attended 5 events in one night. Next. Relationship building is attended one for an extended period of time. So just different examples to make the distinction between the two. I think they're both necessary, strategies, but be conscious of when you're applying which. Next slide. And these are 10 core strategies that I've come across and developed to help you expand your network and build your relationships. Next. You can go to the 10, because I want to be mindful of time. Cool, stop there. So show up as much as possible, cultivate your existing network. I think a lot of times we don't take time to reflect and think about, who do you actually know? Who's that person you went to grade school with, or high school with, or college, or is your neighbor? That might be able to help you with a particular situation or challenge. But then also thinking about, how can you be of service? How can you help? Individuals in your existing network. Are you in a critique group? I make an effort to go to all kinds of places where artists are present. And they might not necessarily be considered an art center, but I think there is always an art community, because art communities for me is what stimulates cities, stimulates neighborhoods. And so having a critique group, I think, is essential. You should never be working in a vacuum. You should really be thinking about, who are people that I respect, whose opinions do I respect, that will help challenge me to want to be better. As they say, steel sharpens steel. Trade artwork with friends and colleagues, participate in residencies. I think residencies are a great vehicle for growth for those who don't go to art school, or don't go to grad school, or they can't afford grad school, whatever the situation may be. I think residencies are another great way. Project Row House is a great example of a organization that has a variety of different ways that artists can engage the community, and be part of that ecosystem. Seek mentorship. And I want to make an important point. Mentorship is not just older, younger. Mentorship could be, I want to learn about, coding. I know nothing about coding, but like, you know, John Doe knows about coding, and John may be 5, 10 years younger than me. It's really, for me, about this give and take. Mentorship is not just you going to someone, hat in hand, waiting to receive this information. It should be an exchange. You should be sharing and helping each other grow. Teach a class if you can. I think it's a great way to crystallize and really be sure you know what you think you know. Collaborate with other artists in your network. Invite people to your studio as much as possible within reason. I think the studio is a sacred space for artists. So just be mindful of who you are inviting, and that they're coming with the right energy and intention. And write about your practice, but I think also write about other artists. I think, you know, particularly like if an artist is working on a new series or a new project, write about it. Because the one thing that for me is frustrating is to talk to an artist and ask them, okay, why did you start this series? And they fumble around the words. And I know sometimes that could be nervousness and being shy, but I think if you take the time to write it, almost script it, then I think it gives you the tools and the insights to kind of think really clearly when you have an opportunity to share about your work in depth. Next slide. Invest in yourself. Next slide. So, the one thing that I get from a lot of artists is they say, I don't have enough time to work. And for me, no one's going to give you the time. If it's something you really want and you're passionate about, you got to steal the time. So whether that's waking up a little bit early in the morning just so you can have an hour, or two, or, staying up a little bit later, like figuring out what are the sacrifices that you can make within reason to allow you to have the time to cultivate whatever your creative expression is. As I mentioned, residencies. The other thing is studying your craft. It's not enough to say that you're an artist, but like study those who came before you and understand like what made their work important, whether they're famous or not. What made their work resonate, what made them, cut through. Learn about the business of art. This is a business, and I think we don't like talking about that. But if you are making something and you're selling it, that means you're engaging in commerce and business, trade and exchange. And I don't, I, you know, I and I don't mean to, oversimplify it, but that is a reality. And oftentimes, I meet artists who don't learn about the business, don't learn about, what a consignment agreement is, looking at, terms for payment, and it's important to keep these things in mind. Leverage the current opportunity into the next opportunity. So always trying to think about where's the hockey puck going and how can you use this current opportunity to audition for the next opportunity, because then it creates a sense of flow, right? And then it creates a sense of energy. I'm a big believer in energy and this kind of karmic energy. Court vision, being able to kind of look at the landscape and observe, see what's happening. Again, where's the hockey puck going, and how does that align with my creative interest and intention? And set reasonable goals and objectives. Next slide. And I have this actualization tool. If anybody's interested, it's called the Safe Plan. Next slide. And it basically, provides space to think about how can you engage certain milestones that you want to achieve. And so let's take, for example, the action is, what did I put here for an example? So let's say, for example, you want to meet with a gallery or a curator, right? And then that's the action, right? And then what resources do you have? Oh, I know Ashley at, DiverseWorks. Maybe they could introduce me to Larry, and then thinking about what's the measurable success. And in this situation is meeting the curator. What's the challenge? Oh, I haven't talked to Ashley in a while. Ashley's been inviting me to DiverseWorks events and I haven't been going. So then how do you persevere through that? You reach out to Ashley, you check in, you have a coffee, you update Ashley on what's going on, and then you see what the result is, and then, constantly kind of measure and continuously improve. Next slide. Act like a pro, 5 mistakes to avoid. Next slide. Next slide. Next. You could go all 5. Don't be a networking jerk. I'm sure you've been at an event and you see the person who's working the room, shoving their card down your throat. Don't be that person. As I mentioned before, this is about cultivating relationships. I won't pretend that you'll be friends with everybody, but there should be, a level of respect and camaraderie, hopefully. You will have some people that you're closer to than others, but don't only be in it because of what someone can do for you. Don't only reach out to people when you need something. I hate that. And if you ever do that for me, I will never respond. Cultivate a relationship. Get to know the person. And follow up. Artists, please. Like, this is one pet peeve for me where, like, if we've talked about something, we've agreed on something, and then you don't follow up, for me, that's just something that, like, one is disrespectful to the relationship we're trying to build, and it's just not being conscious. Like, if you can't do something, just be clear and say you can't. Like, I talked to an artist yesterday, I invited them to an exhibition, and they declined because, they have a particular timeline that they want their work to be seen. And I respect that, and we'll find another opportunity to collaborate. Behaving opportunistically and taking it personally. I think this is a human business. Not everything that occurs is because of something you did. So I think it's just being conscious of the situation, obviously respecting yourself and requiring respect of yourself from people you're collaborating, but also knowing that it's not always personal. Next slide. So again, these are the toolkits, the tools in the toolbox: framework and platform, artistic practice, the art of storytelling, showing up, investing in yourself, and acting like a pro. And so hopefully this information was insightful for you, and I look forward to seeing your questions. Thank you. Next slide. That's it.
Thank you, Larry, so much for, again, participating in our Diverse Discourse guest lecture series, as well as sharing your presentation. I mean, I think, you know, for me and a couple of the people I know that are watching, your presentation is just also a reminder, as you know, Texas is open again, you know, post-COVID. And so we're starting to build new routines and new habits. And you know, and as we're moving through this new world, we're also finding and questioning what balance looks like. So I appreciate you giving us these resources and tools, because I think it will be helpful. And just really, you know, to be honest and authentic. I mean, I'm always thinking about authenticity, you know, and like how you show up in your practice too. So I think this is a really timely and relevant topic about leading with hustle and what hustle looks like, you know, right now.
Yeah, and I think also just one last point, you know, doing your best to put yourself in environments and situations that allow you to show up your full self. I think the last year, you know, has illustrated that, you know, people are just not going to take it anymore. You know, I think particularly, you know, communities that have historically been oppressed. You know, if you're not able to show up for your full self, but also not get the full resources, you know, like I posted a meme on my Instagram today where it's like, you know, the presentation is like this beautiful bottle of Voss water. And then when you get the allocation of funds, it's like, you know, the public faucet with like lemon water, you know? And so just really making sure that, you know, when you're looking at opportunities, that the opportunity is a fit and it's going to allow you to thrive to the best of your ability. And you're not just taking an opportunity because it's an opportunity. Because what will end up happening is you'll be frustrated, you'll feel under-resourced, and then not appreciated. And I think that's still a lot of work we have to do in that space in terms of making sure that artists foundationally are appreciated, compensated properly, curators the same. My pleasure. Which is like a whole nother like layer, but making sure that curators are getting paid a living wage, right? And I think for me, I'm different because I come from a business background and really approach this as an entrepreneur. You know, things that I would have taken 5 years ago for like $1,000, you know, to curate an exhibition, which is a lot of work. Now, what I do is try to think about strategies for younger curators who that's a great opportunity, that's great money for them, and you know, recommend them for their opportunity. You know, and so really just, you know, pulling people up the ladder and making sure that if it's an opportunity that doesn't work for me, trying to see who within my network can benefit from that opportunity, because we all have to kind of go pay our dues. I think that doesn't change, but I think at some point you have to make sure that you're growing and evolving in your practice.
I agree. I mean, totally. I mean, I think that I don't know. I think I mean, there's a lot of things that you're touching upon in your lecture that I think really resonate with me right now. And I think with a lot of artists, you know, going through the city, there are a few questions that are popping up in the chat, and I think you know, one of the things that Houston I think struggles with, and that a lot of individuals are thinking about too, and you kind of touched on it in terms of the art criticism. And so there's a question from Sarah that says, our supporting organizations are so amazing, but inadvertently create non-critical journalism. Would love to know how artists can ask for critique, or maybe take the pressure off the artists to get the arts professionals to be okay with criticism too. Yeah. Or
So I think that's why the strategy of the critique group is something that I think is imperative, right? Because what I find is that in certain markets, a lot of times it's not the organization, it's also the people. Like sometimes we're just too nice, you know, and I'm not saying be mean, right? I think there's a way to provide feedback from a place of love and a place of abundance. But I think, you know, you know, particularly spending time in like cities like Detroit, I've been spending a lot of time in Miami the last 15, 20 years, you don't ever want to come across as a hater, right? When you're calling a spade. But if you're in a critique group, you're creating a condition where all right, I'm going to bring some sculptures and we're going to tear this work apart, right? And I think, unless you've, been in a residency or gone to some type of art or grad program, a lot of people are not used to that, because I know some programs where the crits are out of control, and they break people down. And so for me, I think the crit group is a great strategy. And then I think looking at the landscape and who's really like calling a spade, right? And I think what tends to happen is that those folks tend to be ostracized, for being honest. But how do you, as long as they're coming with love and abundance and the right attitude, actually invite them into conversation to kind of push folks, right? Because for me, it's like there's a way to articulate that an artist is like not getting to the root, right? Or the artist is not pushing themselves, or the artist is not making an effort without saying that, oh, this is whack, right? And I think it's also the language that we use, because there still is a sensitivity. And I admitted this at the top, I wasn't good at critique. Particularly as a photographer, I think photographers are like the most critical of each other. And I wasn't built for it. But it did give me the sensitivity and awareness in terms of like being mindful of the language that I use when I'm talking to artists and trying to come from a position of trying to uplift, but not glazing over something that might be like a deficiency or an opportunity. And so I think if you feel like there's not enough criticism, how do you look at the community and be like, okay, let's put together a crit group, and maybe we meet once a week, every other week, everybody bring their stuff, and let's really kind of get into it. This is not about niceties. You can do it with respect, but it's about like how to steel sharpen steel, right? Because there's many art, like I think about Robert Pruitt, who's a good buddy of mine, artist from Houston. As many artists were able to come from Houston, even if they leave Houston, but can still kind of come back and give back, that helps the ecosystem, right? And then people begin to recognize Houston as, this space for visual art production and not just kind of music and cinema, So I think about Jason Moran, who's also from Houston, and through Jason, I got to know, a whole litany of jazz musicians who come through the same kind of high school. So I think if you don't see it, create it in community. Don't put all the weight on yourself, because I think that's also the natural thing, is that I'm just going to do it myself. Like, it needs to be a collective. And I think that's why I started ARTNOIR. It's 7 of us, and there are going to be times where we all 7 are going to be able to put energy into a project. And sometimes it's just going to be 2. But at the end of the day, the train is still moving.
I love that. I think it leads also really well into this next question that we have, which is, obviously the title of your presentation is Lead with Hustle, but the question is coming from an anonymous. How do you keep up the positive energy when all of the work, i.e. doing the hustle in a professional and passionate way, doesn't lead to as many doors opening or as much as financial support as you would like? Even after 20 years of the art hustle, how do I keep up with this coming decade?
Well, so I think that's where you got to kind of step back and evaluate what's not working, right? Because I think, we get comfortable, it's human. And so you got to think about where you're not pushing yourself. Where are you too comfortable? Because sometimes it's just as small as like, like I was talking to an artist yesterday, and they make all these works on using like a particular material. And I said, have you thought about using this other material? And it was a very simple question that just like was mind blowing to them, right? And sometimes it's as simple as like material use, right? And then also the reality is that depending on what market you are in, because you've been doing it for 20 years, sometimes people take you for granted. And that's real. So then thinking about, all right, well, if it's not popular for me in Houston, can I shoot over to Dallas? Can I do the Art Pace residency in San Antonio? Can I shoot over to Austin? You know, can I go up north to Kansas City? So then thinking about what markets can you go to that people will be a little bit more responsive. And I'm not saying move, but look at opportunities outside of your sphere of influence and put yourself out there, you know. But the thing is, it's like if it's not clicking, you have to look at why it's not clicking. It's like turning your stove on. Like, what's not igniting the pilot? And I think sometimes we don't honestly ask ourselves these questions. And that's why I developed that actualization tool, the safe plan. Because you putting it in paper. Like, what are my challenges? And how am I going to work through this? So like, you know, is it because I've been working as a, sculptor and like Houston just isn't a place for sculptors? Or, maybe like I was talking to an artist and said, have you thought about public art? Because I know that Houston has a lot of sprawl. And we talked about this actually in their programs, right? And I think the other thing is like really looking at your network and who you know, and not necessarily people just in the arts. You might know somebody, excuse me, yesterday I was talking to a collector in Canada, for example, and we're looking at a particular project, and there are people supporting the project that don't come from the arts, but they are artistically inclined, or they're philanthropists. So I think, examine why it's not working. Um, if you're interested, I can send you the safe plan and really kind of map it out, because the thing is, it's like, if you're putting the work in, you have faith, but you're also constantly trying to adapt. And as Bruce Lee says, be like water and grow and push yourself, you know, the pressure will bust pipes. But if you're not putting yourself in an uncomfortable zone, then, things are just going to be status quo. And I think for me as a curator, I'm always constantly trying to figure out, all right, you know, not that I've mastered this, but like I could do this in my sleep. So it's like, it's kind of like Jack White. He's a great example where like he, has this busted guitar where he clearly has like money to buy like a nice one, but he wants to go through that struggle. I think, for him, maybe that creatively keeps him inspired and honest. And so just making sure that like you're really asking yourself these tough questions. And then, in collaboration with people in your community and network, um, figure out ways to kind of like get to the next level.
I always think about Nicolas Cage in terms of curating and like movie acting, in terms of like when I ask myself what kind of curator do I want to be, I'm like, Nicolas Cage, he still curate, or he acts in movies regardless of whatever the title is. Like, he's not limiting himself. And so I think what you're also describing is understanding what success looks like for all of us, and identifying those like you can still be a successful artist and have a practice, or a successful curator, but you don't have to be like Academy Award. Like, you can find other avenues, or like there's different ways in which your practice can show up, I think.
Exactly. And I think for me, it's always been about sustainability, right? And not sustainability in terms of like the minimum, but like, how do you create a condition if you're interested where like I can live off being a curator, or I can live off being an artist, or maybe I have to teach, maybe I have to assist an artist, right? But whatever is going to create the freedom, honestly, to do the thing that you love to do, in a sensible way, in a healthy way, in a safe way. Those are the things that I'm always trying to discover, right? And then when I figure things out, share that with other curators, right? So I think if you've been following what's happening with the administration, there's going to be a lot of money pumped into infrastructure. And it's probably going to be the most money pumped into infrastructure since the New Deal. And so thinking about what does that mean? That means roads. That means, hopefully parks being renovated. I'm sure in Houston, there's a lot of development that's happening, and there is a requirement in some cities, I don't know about Houston, that a certain percentage of that needs to be allocated to the arts, right? So are we having conversations with, developers? What's our conversations looking like with local officials? And having a constellation of resources that you access, right? Because I think you can't be dependent on one thing. Like the government is not going to provide an inordinate amount of resources for the arts, but they can at least put some policy in place that allows you to kind of identify verticals and spaces where your art can be seen, right? And so, like, is it about your art being seen in a gallery, or is it about your art being seen in a place that's meaningful and that you can be proud of? And so you're perfectly right. What does success look like for you? And for me, success is being able to pay my rent every month, and be surrounded by this beautiful art. And if it's something that doesn't really allow me to do that, now I have to really kind of question, like, what am I spending time on? Because I have so many projects, I can't say yes to everything. And so that's a very important part, Ashley, that you make.
So we still have a few more minutes for questions if anybody else has any questions. I do have some curiosity in terms of how ARTNOIR is how y'all decide like programming and as a collective voice of 7, how that structurally works, when you're projects together.
So fundamentally, it's about celebrating Black and Brown artists, curators, cultural workers, and honestly, really just all POC communities. And so for us, we started off as simple as just doing art trips. And it was just like, hey, I'm going to Philadelphia to the Barnes Foundation. Who wants to come? And we realized through that, a lot of people are artistically curious, but never feel welcome. So, when we want to do an event, for example, or a collaboration, it's thinking about, what is our relationship with that artist? And what is that experience? What kind of value is that going to add? And so, fundamentally, we're always thinking about visual arts, performance, literature, and it's just as simple as like, if you were part of the crew, Ashley, you'd be like, hey, Larry, John the Comfort's gonna have this exhibition at, Cam Houston. Janice is my homegirl, deputy director. I would love to do a walkthrough with like, 15, 20 people. It's COVID, so we can't have a lot of people. But, and it's just, and then you just got to be willing to quarterback it. I think we've been in existence since 2013, and we know each other well enough that we trust each other's taste, and I think now what we've been doing is figuring out how do we level out. And so last year we started the Jar of Love microgrant program to help people who were impacted by COVID. And then this year we're going to be launching a scholarship program for POC MFA students. And so thinking about now, how do we extend the work, right? And then what's also great, to be honest, is that we have diverse backgrounds, so some of us work in the arts, some of us work in music, some of us work in public relations, travel. And so that dynamic kind of thinking and skill set also allows us to kind of have a variety of, points of view. Some of my co-founders are parents now, so now we got to think about, what's something that would be great for our friends who have kids to participate in. So we did a trip to Storm King in the fall, in October, right before it was closing for the season. And, it was an opportunity for us to kind of just get out, but still social distance and be responsible, and then also fellowship. So it's a case by case scenario, but usually we trust each other enough to know that if someone's proposing something, they've kind of thought out all the parameters.
Thank you. I think we talked a little bit about my experience in grad school, and one of the things is we were having to curate collectively, and so the program always talks about like how do you bring in different curatorial voices, and so that's always an interest in how when people are organizing and doing it in a way that it is making impacts, because it can also be very like it could be a struggle,
Yeah, but I think that comes down to, do you trust the person?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you don't trust the person, it's going to be constant this.
Yeah.
So you have to, and this is why I said before, like, you're not going to be friends with everybody, but there has to be a certain level of just kind of trust and respect, right? And 9 times out of 10, I want to believe if we're at the table together, you know your stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the only issue I would have is if somebody's lazy. So don't put minimum effort. We all have to put maximum effort because we got other stuff we got to deal with. We got to deal with life. And so I think when you run into those situations, I call that out quick because I don't have the energy for it. And then I think if someone is offended by that, I mean, they got to kind of really kind of look in the mirror and be like, okay, well, if 3 people are calling me out on my effort level, am I not putting maximum effort? And it's never coming from a place of trying to like break you down, but it's like, if we gonna put the work in, we got to put it in together. And then after this project is done, we might never have to see each other again.
Yeah.
So I think it's this fundamental respect as a human being, as a colleague, and if that's something that just can't be established, and then other means and measures need to be explored.
Exactly. So I appreciate all your insight, and we do have one question in the chat that was sent to me. And this kind of goes back a little bit, and just really thinking about your overall presentation. Can you talk about the idea of curators as gatekeepers in the contemporary, in the current climate, and the complications of the profession, and fully embracing and advocating for equity in the arts?
So what I like to say to that question is I'd like to use a phrase by one of my co-founders, Danny Baez, who also runs Regular Normal Gallery and Mecca. I like to look at myself as a gate opener, right? I will never really embrace the idea of like gatekeeper because like I wasn't invited to the table. I had to build my own table. And that's also why we started ARTNOIR, right? Because it was like, there was a moment in time where like, just to get invited and be considered for exhibitions, like, was a struggle, right? And when I knew things were changing is when I was getting invited to do shows and didn't have to write a proposal, right? And so kind of recognizing that change. But I think it's important to kind of, evaluate the landscape and look at who's in your community and looking at the curators who are really about it. They don't talk, they actually, you see it through action. For me, I rather execute through action, and Art Noir is a manifestation of that journey and drive towards equity. We don't always get it perfect, but I think it's a community that we're looking to grow and challenge ourselves and figure out how we can do better work. So I think seeking out the people who are doing the work and uplifting them, I think is one strategy, and collaborating with them. And for the people who aren't doing the work, calling a spade, and there's a lot of ways to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to kind of like out them per se, but have a meeting with them and kind of like figure out like, okay, Houston has a plethora of XYZ. What's up? Why aren't we getting opportunities, right? One, but then two, I come from the Bronx. If I see something I don't like, I'm gonna just get the crew together. We're gonna go do it ourselves, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that POC communities, they drive culture, right? And we inherently have to make something out of lack of resources. I won't say nothing, but lack of resources, right? And I think we're in a moment now where there's a window of opportunity to, raid the castle, so to speak, for the resources that we have historically deserved, right? So I think again, acknowledge, figure out who's doing the work, how do you support, how do you work together, how do you uplift them, how do you drive energy, resources, because there's always going to be, a handful of people who are in the third ward who've been doing this little project and like they've been consistently doing it, and like, the mainstream's not giving it attention, but it just takes one or two people who like, you know, have those relationships to say, you know what, this is important and we're going to support it. And that's why I chose to collaborate with DiverseWorks and participate in this, right? Because like I know Houston has talent, and hopefully I can share some insight from my experience, one, but then two, discover some talent. Like that's my job. Like a curator who's going to be a gatekeeper to opportunity. That's not somebody that I really rock with. For me, it's like I constantly have to be on the lookout for new talent. Whether they're younger or older, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean these will be people I work with formally, but I know a lot of other curators, and I can say, hey, there's this dope artist that I met, when I was in such and such. You should check them out. Sculptor, And so it also depends on the disposition. And I think it also is like researching that individual's politics. Because I think a lot of times, like, artists will say they want to work with a particular curator, but really haven't done their homework on, like, what have they done historically? What if they supported historically? Are they the one that's, for me, are they going to be touching the hood when they come to Houston? Or are they just going to stay downtown? And it's not a shame thing. Some people, that's what they do. Like me, because of where I grew up and where I come from, I want to be amongst the people, because it's not about just engaging with artists, it's engaging with community and trying to understand the temperature and the dynamic. And you have some people who are not interested in that. And they kind of want to just kind of come and function within the wheelhouse of the institution, which is fine too. Everybody's entitled to kind of focus on what they're interested in. So I think understanding who you're dealing with is basically what I'm saying, right? Not everybody's going to be here for you, but also, skin folk and kinfolk. So just because they look like you don't mean they're going to ride for you either. So it's really kind of understanding and doing the research, understanding the nuance, because sometimes your best ally might not look like you, or they might be totally antithetical to who you are and what you believe. But I think that's the beauty of life. And if you're open and you do a little bit of research and knowledge, you'll be pleasantly surprised. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a lot of really interesting, I don't know, like there's a lot of different things that you've brought up throughout your presentation and throughout just our conversation, that it's in terms of it, kind of unveiling the behind the scenes and like really scaling back and thinking about things. As I was kind of doing research on you, I was reading an article and I can't remember the title of it. But one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated me in the article was like, and you kind of just touched on, was the fact that like, as a curator, like you are looking for work that matters in this moment, that is in terms of, you were talking about how that, even if it's work that may not align with your aesthetics on a personal level, you are acknowledging the importance of it being created within a space.
And that's something I learned from one of my mentors, Bob Buck, rest in peace, Bob, and he taught me, one of the number one things you have to do as a curator is separate what's important from what you like, right? And so there are a lot of things that, like, I collect too. I've been collecting over the last 10 years, and sometimes my impetus and interest might be like, oh, I would want to live with that. And then there are times where, like, I would never want to live with that. But that does not make that artistic expression and cultural production invalid, right? And so, and also doing my best. I'm not going to pretend like I see everything, right? There's just going to be opportunity times where things fall through the cracks. And I always try to be transparent about that, because the reality is that, as a curator, you also have to do the work, right? And you can't be spending an inordinate amount of time on, like, Instagram responding to DMs and, like, because it's like people come to you because of your accomplishments. But if you're not doing the work to continue to accomplish, then you're putting yourself behind the eight ball. But I think for me, that's why it's just important to always test the temperature, because I just feel like, the working class communities, indigenous communities, that's where the action is. That's where reality is. And always making sure that, like, I'm engaging with that, in some shape or form, whatever that may look like. And that could just be something as simple as like, when I'm in Chicago, going to Harold's in the South Side and just doing some ethnographic research and just kind of looking at and listening to what people are talking about. And I think it just comes from me just also just wanting to be a cultural sponge and kind of understand, like, when I go to Houston, you know, when I'm in Houston, where am I gonna where's you know, where is the cultural expression through food? Where's the sonic cultural expression? Where is like the aesthetic, through fashion or makeup or, slabs, car culture, right? Um, because for me that's all resonant and it's all important. And these are the things that give us space to find joy, to be honest, or to navigate and wrestle with pain, and so always doing the best I can to kind of remain in that posture. I'm not. Sometimes I fumble. That's human, but it's always something that is salient on my mind.
I love that. And I love also reminding that we're human. Larry, it has been an immense pleasure hosting you with Diverse Discourse and then having you speak to the artists. And, I look forward to seeing what happens from this conversation. And anybody who is interested, you can follow Larry on Instagram as well as Facebook. But we are out of time. So we have to say goodbye. And I feel like I can talk to you for days. So I appreciate your time.
Well, I'm sure, I appreciate the hard work that you and the organization do, everybody who came out, all the artists who shared space. For me, I just look at it as the beginning of a conversation, and I look forward to an opportunity to continue to be in dialogue. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we definitely have to get you back out to Houston again. I think
once. Yeah. I mean, I know you guys are open, which like that's a whole other conversation. But I actually will be in Austin in July.
Okay.
Deborah Roberts has an exhibition there that I'm looking to check out, so maybe I can shoot over to Houston. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to start a dialogue with the community and look forward to having an opportunity to continue to engage.
Awesome. Well, yeah, if you're here in July, we'd love to see you, meet you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This conversation and presentation will be archived on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So you can visit DiverseWorks.org to rewatch it or to learn more about the Diverse Discourse program. We will have, and we have 2 Diverse Discourse every year, one in the fall, one in the spring. So look out for our fall guest speaker, which will be announced later over the summer.